You have implemented no contact with the avoidant, stopped reaching out, stopped responding to their minimal breadcrumb attempts at connection, stopped checking their social media, stopped making yourself available for the sporadic contact they initiated when their defended comfort required your presence. Yet, you struggle to trust the process because the silence feels unbearable, because their lack of response makes you question whether no contact works with avoidance, because every day without hearing from them generates doubt about whether they will ever reach out or whether you have simply made it easier for them to move on completely. You feel tempted to break no contact through reaching out to check whether they are thinking about you, through responding to their eventual minimal contact to avoid seeming harsh or closed off, through softening your boundary because the silence creates more discomfort for you than you anticipated tolerating. Yet, these temptations to break no contact reflect your misunderstanding of how no contact operates with avoidance and why trusting the process requires maintaining the boundary, even when the avoidance initial response appears to confirm your fears that no contact simply allows them comfortable exit. No contact with avoidance functions differently than no contact with other attachment styles because the avoidance defensive structure initially experiences no contact as gift. You have eliminated the pressure they felt from your presence, removed the demands they experienced through your needs, provided them the space and distance their defended position craves. This initial period, where the avoidant appears comfortable or even relieved by your absence, does not indicate no contact has failed. It indicates no contact is working exactly as it must work with defended avoidants who require time to move through their initial relief at eliminated pressure toward eventual recognition of what your absence actually costs them. The avoidant will yield to no contact, will reach out, will experience the discomfort that generates their pursuit of reconnection. But this yielding operates on timeline determined by how long their defensive structure can maintain comfort in your complete absence before that absence penetrates their defenses sufficiently to generate intolerable discomfort that overcomes their resistance to vulnerable pursuit. Trusting no contact requires understanding that the avoidance yielding is not immediate response to your absence, but rather is eventual consequence of sustained absence that their defenses cannot indefinitely manage. It requires accepting that the process operates on timeline you cannot control or accelerate through breaking contact. It requires maintaining your boundary through the initial period when the avoidant appears unaffected by your absence until sufficient time passes that your absence creates effects their defensive structure cannot comfortably sustain. The avoidant yields not because you implement no contact, but because you maintain no contact long enough that the absence generates consequences their defenses fail to manage adequately. Your sustained absence eliminates their comfortable middle distance, destroys their narrative that you remain available despite their inadequacy, forces them to experience actual loss rather than theoretical loss, and creates discomfort their usual defensive mechanisms cannot resolve. Yet you're yielding to them during no contact, your breaking of the boundary through reaching out or through responding to their minimal contact teaches them that your boundaries are temporary, that sufficient time or sufficient breadcrumbs will cause you to break your position, that they can wait out your no contact until you yield to them rather than them having to yield to the discomfort your absence creates. No contact eliminates the comfortable distance the avoidant relies on. The avoidant has operated throughout the relationship using specific distance management strategy where they maintain defended middle ground between complete connection that would overwhelm their defended capacity and complete separation that would activate their attachment system and force them to face loss. This middle distance allows them optimal defended comfort. They maintain enough connection to prevent activation of loss or abandonment fears while maintaining enough distance to prevent activation of engulfment or intimacy anxieties. They achieve this comfortable middle distance through pattern of sporadic contact, through withdrawal followed by return, through maintaining you as available option. They can access when their defended isolation becomes too uncomfortable, while retreating when connection exceeds their intimacy tolerance. Your previous behavior enabled this comfortable distance management by remaining available during their withdrawals, by accepting their sporadic contact as sufficient, by allowing them to regulate their intimacy through controlling the distance while you remained consistently accessible. No contact eliminates the comfortable middle distance entirely by removing you as a available option they can access to regulate their defended comfort. The avoidant can no longer withdraw to comfortable distance knowing you remain available for them to approach when isolation becomes uncomfortable, because your complete absence means they cannot approach you without taking vulnerable action of explicit pursuit that their defended position resists. They cannot maintain their optimal defended distance because the only distances available are complete absence of contact or vulnerable direct pursuit. The comfortable middle ground where they could regulate intimacy through controlling contact while you remained passively available has been eliminated by your boundary. This elimination of comfortable distance initially feels like relief to the avoidant because your absence removes the pressure they experienced from your presence, eliminates the guilt they felt about their inadequate provision, and removes the demands your needs placed on their defended capacity. The avoidant experiences initial period of defended comfort in your absence where they feel free from relationship pressure, unburdened by your expectations, and relieved of the guilty awareness that they were failing to meet your needs. This initial relief does not indicate no contact has failed. It indicates the first phase of no contact, where the avoidant's defensive structure successfully manages your absence through relief at eliminated pressure. Yet this relief cannot sustain indefinitely because your complete absence differs fundamentally from the controlled distance the avoidant previously managed. The controlled distance provided them access to you when they needed reassurance or connection, while allowing retreat when intimacy exceeded comfort. Your complete absence provides no access, no ability to use you to regulate their defended discomfort, and no option to approach you for reassurance during periods when their isolation becomes too uncomfortable. The avoidant faces that they cannot regulate their internal state through controlling distance from you because you are completely gone rather than waiting at distance they can close when needed. The elimination of comfortable distance forces the avoidant to face their actual attachment to you because they can no longer maintain the defended illusion that they did not need you or that the connection was not important to them. When you remained available during their withdrawals, when you accepted their distance management, the avoidant could maintain that your availability was their choice rather than recognizing their dependence on your consistent presence. They could tell themselves they could take you or leave you, that they maintained connection only because they chose to rather than because they needed to. Your complete absence destroys this defended narrative by forcing them to confront that they cannot simply access you when convenient, that you are not waiting available for their approach, that they have lost something they depended upon more than their defended position allowed them to acknowledge. The discomfort from eliminated comfortable distance intensifies across time as the avoidant's usual defensive mechanisms fail to restore their comfort. The avoidant attempts to manage discomfort through familiar strategies. They distract themselves with other activities. They tell themselves they are fine without you. They focus on your inadequacies to justify your absence. They potentially pursue shallow replacement connections. Yet, these defensive strategies cannot replicate the specific functions you provided, cannot restore the comfortable distance they relied upon, and cannot eliminate the growing awareness that they have lost access to something they needed, even as their defended structure prevented them from adequately valuing or reciprocating that provision. The avoidant yields when the discomfort from eliminated comfortable distance exceeds their defended resistance to vulnerable pursuit. The timeline for this yielding varies based on the avoidant's defensive strength, based on whether they have adequate alternative sources providing the functions you provided, and based on how deeply they were actually attached to you beneath their defended presentation. Yet, the mechanism remains consistent. The avoidant yields not immediately, but eventually, when their defensive structure cannot sustain comfort without access to you, when the complete absence creates sufficient discomfort that vulnerable pursuit of reconnection feels less threatening than continued absence. Trusting no contact requires accepting that the elimination of comfortable distance operates on timeline you cannot control. The avoidant will not yield immediately because initially your absence feels like relief from pressure. The yielding comes later, after sufficient time passes. That relief gives way to discomfort their defenses cannot manage, after they have attempted and failed to restore comfort through their usual mechanisms, after the eliminated comfortable distance creates effects that overcome their defended resistance to vulnerable pursuit. Your role involves maintaining the boundary long enough for this process to unfold, rather than breaking contact during the initial relief period when the avoidant appears unaffected by your absence. The silence destroys their narrative that you'll always be available. The avoidant has relied throughout the relationship on implicit assumption that you will remain available regardless of their behavior, that your patience is unlimited, that you will accept their patterns indefinitely without establishing consequences that threaten their access to you. This assumption developed through your historical pattern of remaining present during their withdrawals, accepting their sporadic contact, and tolerating their inadequate treatment without implementing boundaries that would cost them your availability. The avoidant learned through experience that they could withdraw without losing you, could provide minimal effort without you leaving, and could maintain their defended patterns without facing genuine risk that those patterns would cost them permanent loss of access to you. This learned expectation that you will always be available allowed them comfortable defended position where they could regulate intimacy through withdrawal while maintaining security that you would remain accessible for their return. Your sustained no-contact silence destroys this narrative by demonstrating definitively that you are not always available, that their patterns have consequences that include loss of access to you, and that you have capacity to establish and maintain boundaries that eliminate their comfortable assumption of your permanence. The silence communicates what your words during the relationship could not communicate, that you have limits to your tolerance, that their inadequate treatment costs them your presence, and that you are willing to accept complete absence rather than continuing to accept their defended patterns. This communication through sustained silence penetrates the avoidance defenses more effectively than verbal communication because silence cannot be argued with, negotiated, or deflected through their usual defensive mechanisms. The destruction of the permanence narrative occurs gradually as your silence extends from days to weeks to months. Initially, the avoidant may assume your silence is temporary reaction that will pass once you calm down, that you are engaging in strategic withdrawal designed to make them chase you, that you will break your silence when you miss them sufficiently, or when you recognize that your boundary cost you the relationship. These assumptions allow the avoidant to maintain their comfortable narrative that you remain essentially available even during your silence, that you are just temporarily upset or employing strategy rather than genuinely removing yourself from their reach. Yet, as your silence extends, as you demonstrate through sustained absence that you are not breaking contact, not responding to their minimal breadcrumbs if they test your boundary, and not checking their social media or maintaining any connection to them, the avoidance comfortable assumptions begin to fail. They face growing recognition that your silence is not temporary strategy, but rather is sustained boundary, that you are not positioning yourself at distance, waiting for their approach, but rather have genuinely removed yourself from availability to them, and that they cannot assume you will remain accessible option they can access when convenient. This recognition forces uncomfortable awareness that they have lost something they took for granted, that their patterns had consequences they did not anticipate, that you possess capacity to remove yourself, and that their defended assumptions about your permanent availability did not account for. The destruction of the permanence narrative creates specific crisis for the avoidant because it eliminates the security that allowed their defended patterns to operate comfortably. The avoidant could maintain sporadic contact, could withdraw repeatedly, and could provide minimal effort precisely because they assumed these patterns would not cost them permanent loss, that you would remain available despite their inadequacy, would accept their return despite their withdrawal, and would maintain your presence despite their patterns. Your sustained silence destroys this security by proving their assumption wrong, by demonstrating that their patterns do cost them permanent loss, and that you will not remain available regardless of their behavior. This destroyed security creates anxiety the avoidant's defensive structure struggles to manage because the anxiety stems not from threat of intimacy, but from threat of permanent loss that their defenses did not adequately prepare them to face. The narrative destruction also forces the avoidant to confront their own responsibility for the loss. When you remained available during their withdrawals, the avoidant could maintain that the relationship continued because they chose to maintain it, that your presence reflected their willingness to engage rather than reflecting your patience and accommodation. Your sustained silence eliminates this deflection by making clear that your absence results from their patterns, that they lost you through their own choices and behaviors, and that they bear responsibility for consequences they can no longer avoid through accessing your continued availability. This confrontation with their responsibility generates discomfort. Their defensive structure exists to avoid yet cannot avoid when your silence makes the consequences of their patterns undeniable. The avoidant yields when the destroyed permanence narrative creates sufficient anxiety about permanent loss that vulnerable pursuit feels less threatening than accepting your continued absence. The yielding involves them reaching out not with minimal breadcrumbs, but with more substantial contact that acknowledges they cannot assume your availability, that they need to actively pursue reconnection, and that your silence has communicated limits to your tolerance that their patterns exceeded. The timeline for this yielding depends on how quickly the destroyed narrative generates anxiety that overcomes their defended resistance to vulnerable pursuit. Some avoidants yield within weeks when permanence anxiety activates strongly. Others require months before the destroyed narrative generates sufficient discomfort to overcome their defended position. Trusting no contact requires maintaining silence long enough to destroy the permanence narrative completely rather than breaking silence prematurely when the avoidance still assumes your availability is temporarily withdrawn rather than permanently removed. Breaking contact before the narrative is destroyed simply reinforces their assumption that you will always be available, teaches them that sustained silence is temporary strategy. They can wait out rather than permanent boundary they must respect. The destruction requires your sustained absence demonstrating through time that you have genuinely removed yourself rather than strategically positioning yourself at distance. No contact forces them to experience actual loss instead of theoretical loss. The avoidant maintained throughout their relationship abstract theoretical awareness that their patterns could cost them the relationship, that you might eventually reach limit of your tolerance, and that their inadequate presence might result in you leaving. Yet, this theoretical awareness remained abstract rather than concrete because you continued accepting their patterns despite your expressions of hurt or frustration, continued remaining available despite their withdrawal, and continued accommodating their limitations despite communicating that those limitations harmed you. The gap between your words expressing that their patterns were problematic and your actions of continuing to accept those patterns taught the avoidant that loss was theoretical possibility rather than actual consequence. You might say their behavior could cost them the relationship, but your continued presence despite that behavior demonstrated the loss was not actually imminent or real. Now, no contact transforms theoretical loss into actual concrete loss by eliminating the gap between your words and your actions. You are not telling them their patterns might cost them the relationship while continuing to accept those patterns. You are demonstrating through your absence that their patterns have cost them the relationship, that the theoretical loss has become actual loss, and that consequences you described are now consequences they are experiencing. This transformation from abstract possibility to concrete reality creates fundamentally different psychological experience for the avoidant because actual loss generates emotional responses and psychological effects that theoretical loss does not trigger. The experience of actual loss manifests through specific concrete deprivations the avoidant faces in your absence. They can no longer access your emotional support when their defended isolation becomes uncomfortable. They cannot use your presence to regulate their anxiety or to provide reassurance during periods of stress. They have lost the specific functions you provided: your understanding, your patience, your willingness to accommodate their patterns, and your consistent availability that allowed them to maintain defended comfort. These concrete deprivations differ fundamentally from theoretical awareness that they could lose these things. The actual experience of not having access to what you provided creates immediate tangible discomfort that theoretical loss never generated. The actual loss also eliminates the avoidant's ability to maintain comfortable defended narrative about the relationship. When loss was theoretical, when you remained present despite their patterns, the avoidant could tell themselves they could improve if necessary, could provide more if required, and could show up adequately if the relationship truly required it. Your continued presence, despite their failure to improve or provide more or show up adequately, allowed these comforting narratives to persist untested. Your absence destroys these narratives by proving they did not improve, did not provide more, and did not show up adequately when the relationship required it. The theoretical opportunity to change before loss occurred has passed, leaving them facing actual loss that their defended narratives could not prevent. The transition from theoretical to actual loss particularly impacts the avoidant's defensive structure because their defenses evolved to manage threats of intimacy and engulfment rather than threats of abandonment and loss. The avoidant's defensive mechanisms effectively manage pressure to be closer, demands for more intimacy, and requests for greater emotional availability. They simply withdraw, create distance, and regulate through controlling contact. Yet, these same defensive mechanisms struggle to manage actual loss because withdrawal and distance creation cannot restore what has been lost, cannot eliminate discomfort that stems from absence rather than from presence. The avoidant faces discomfort their usual defensive strategies cannot resolve because those strategies were designed to manage too much connection rather than to manage not enough connection. The actual loss also activates the avoidance attachment system in ways theoretical loss did not activate. Theoretical loss allows the avoidant to maintain their deactivated attachment state because the attachment figure remains available even while discussing potential loss. Actual loss through your sustained absence activates attachment anxiety that deactivation cannot fully suppress. The avoidance nervous system responds to actual absence of attachment figure with activation that theoretical discussions of potential absence did not generate. This activation creates internal experience the avoidant cannot comfortably manage through their usual deactivating strategies because the activation stems from actual loss. Their nervous system registers as threat requiring response. The avoidant yields when actual loss creates sufficient discomfort that their defensive structure cannot manage without attempting to restore what has been lost. The yielding involves them pursuing reconnection not because they have overcome their defended patterns, but because the actual experience of losing you generates discomfort that exceeds the discomfort of vulnerable pursuit, because their attachment system activation in response to actual loss overcomes their defended resistance to pursuing, and because concrete deprivation creates urgency that theoretical loss never generated. The timeline for this yielding depends on how long the avoidant can tolerate actual loss before the discomfort becomes intolerable. Some avoidants yield quickly when actual loss activates strong attachment anxiety. Others tolerate actual loss longer before the accumulated deprivation generates sufficient discomfort to overcome defended resistance. Trusting no contact requires accepting that actual loss must be sustained long enough to generate effects theoretical loss never created. The avoidant will not yield to theoretical loss. They manage theoretical awareness of potential loss throughout relationship without changing patterns. The yielding comes from actual loss, creating concrete experiences their defensive structure cannot comfortably manage. Your role involves maintaining no contact long enough that theoretical possibility you might be gone transforms into actual sustained experience of you being gone that generates effects their defenses cannot resolve. The avoidant yields when their defensive structure fails to restore comfort. The avoidant's defensive structure operates through specific mechanisms designed to restore their comfort. When they experience anxiety or discomfort, they withdraw to create distance that reduces intimacy anxiety. They deactivate their attachment to reduce need for connection. They distract themselves with other activities or relationships to avoid facing feelings. And they rationalize and minimize to reduce emotional impact of situations. These defensive mechanisms have successfully managed discomfort throughout their life, have allowed them to maintain defended comfort through various challenges and relationship difficulties, and have proven reliable enough that the avoidant trusts these mechanisms to resolve whatever discomfort they encounter. Your previous accommodation of their patterns allowed these defensive mechanisms to function effectively. When they withdrew, you remained available for their return. When they deactivated, your continued pursuit reassured them they still mattered. When they distracted themselves, you waited patiently. When they rationalized their patterns, you accepted their justifications. No contact creates fundamentally different conditions where the avoidant's usual defensive mechanisms failed to restore their comfort because your absence eliminates the accommodations that previously allowed those mechanisms to function. The avoidant withdraws, but withdrawal does not restore comfort because withdrawal worked previously by creating temporary distance they could close when ready to reconnect, whereas your absence means withdrawal simply maintains or increases distance without providing option to restore connection when they desire it. They attempt to deactivate their attachment, but deactivation fails because your sustained absence keeps activating their attachment system in ways that deactivation cannot fully suppress. They distract themselves, yet distraction provides only temporary relief because your absence creates ongoing void that distractions cannot fill. They rationalize your absence, yet rationalization does not eliminate the concrete deprivations they experience or restore access to functions you provided. The failure of defensive mechanisms to restore comfort creates crisis for the avoidant because their entire psychological organization depends on these mechanisms successfully managing discomfort. When the mechanisms fail, when the familiar strategies do not restore defended comfort, the avoidant faces unfamiliar experience of being unable to regulate their internal state through their usual approaches. This failure generates increasing destabilization as the avoidant attempts their defensive strategies repeatedly, finds those strategies ineffective at resolving discomfort from your absence, and faces that they lack alternative mechanisms to manage the specific form of discomfort your sustained absence creates.